All right, welcome back. Glad you're back with us for week 3 of our Powerful Practices series. We will start today by just acknowledging that we are all meeting today on the ancestral territories of the Tsawwassen, Musqueam, and other Coast Salish people, and we are deeply thankful to be meeting and learning and talking and playing together on that ancestral territory. And we do just acknowledge and raise our hands to the elders who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. So we are in our 6-part series. We are part 3, week 3 today, looking at some of the challenges of why learning is hard to see. 3 more weeks to go, and we hope that you stick with us as we continue through this whole 6-part series. As always, you'll find the slides, recordings, and other information on the website, deltalearns.ca/powerful practices. We're going to go over some things today that maybe cause some, maybe a bit provocative, or get at some core beliefs that you might have. And again, we just, as we've always said, we just ask that you try to maintain an open mind, think about the evidence that we're drawing from, and just see this as an opportunity to think and to question and to just be reflective in terms of some of the things we're doing in our classroom. We talked last week about retrieval practice, and we shared this example of a couple of students or different studies that have been done, where if we ask students to do rereading in the short term, as you can see here, they do better. But if we ask them to do a bit of reading, a bit of learning, and then a retrieval activity, that they often in the short term score worse. However, what we talked about last week was that over time, we can see in groups, both B and C, that as students do rereading, or as students do retrieval on any piece of learning, even though the short-term performance might be lower, the long-term performance is better. And so as students move from testing after 5 minutes to testing after 2 days to a week, retrieval starts to show be much more impactful on student learning. What we didn't talk about last week was another part of that study, which was the predicted performance or the confidence of the students or their experience in those different scenarios. What happened in those studies, and it's been repeated many, many times, is if you ask students in the moment, which feels more productive, which feels like it's benefiting their learning better, which is generating more confidence of their learning, students are going to choose repeated reading over the reading and retrieval practice. And so that's their predicted there, even though we know that over time, the actual performance of retrieval is significantly better. So there's some important, really important insights here, that we are not always good judges of our learning. The things that we think work aren't necessarily the things that work, and we can often be confused or have illusions that we are more competent than we actually are. This comes from a great article that Satnam and I both really liked as we were putting this together. While knowing how to manage one's own learning has become increasingly important in recent years, research on learning, memory, and metacognitive processes have provided evidence that people often have a faulty mental memory of how they learn and remember, making them prone to both misassessing and mismanaging their own learning. So if we're serious about metacognition, we're serious about self-regulated learning, we need to be really aware that we, all learners, and particularly what we're going to see, novice learners, can often be very poor judges of both what they know and what works for their own learning. So that's going to be our core idea for today. Since learning is invisible, complex, and occurs over time, we are often poor judges of our learning. And we're going to see this in 2 different ways. We're going to see it from the learner perspective, and we're going to see it from the teacher perspective. Satnam is going to take us away with introducing some perspectives on the learner perspective.
And I'm going to talk a little bit just for the next 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, about this from a learner perspective, and then Neil's going to bring it back to a teacher perspective and kind of work through some implications. So I think we can all agree. Oh, let me just get rid of this video here. I think we can all agree that a really simplified way of thinking about learning from a student's perception includes these components, right? Probably includes others depending on who's doing the model, but certainly, students engage with the content that is presented to them. They try to make some sense of it. As they're doing that, they're thinking about what they know, what they don't know, what their strengths or their stretches might be in relation to this new content. Um, and then they start to make a bit of a plan for what their next steps will be once, so they can kind of consolidate their learning or go further with it. As they're moving along, they're checking back to see how they're doing, right? Is this working for me? Isn't this working for me? Do I need to adjust a strategy? The challenge here is that everybody, every learner, whether you're an adult or a student, um, a K to 12 student, has cognitive biases that are just there, usually unknown to us, that can disrupt this journey. So it's not quite as straightforward as those straight arrows. What I wanted to share with you today was just 3 common biases, um, which some of you might actually be aware of, and it might be kind of relatively new for some of you. The 3 are, number 1, just this initial filter or lens that learners have when they approach new content. The second one is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's basically the illusion of competence. That's another way of thinking about it. And the third one is this comfort of what's working now, or what feels good, or what feels easy, right? It's this um, kind of innate sense that most or many learners have, that is that learning shouldn't really be hard. So they'll kind of orient themselves to strategies that are easier. So I'm just going to talk about each of these 3 here with some illustrations. So the first one is that whole notion of that initial lens or filter, right? So different learners are going to bring different filters to the learning conversation. This can include the type of background knowledge that someone might have about the topic that's at hand. It could include their mindset, right? If you kind of have a fixed mindset and you're convinced that you can't do something, then when that new material is being presented to you, you're going to be approaching it in a different way and possibly seeing different things and different possibilities than a peer who's opening it with a bit more of an open mindset. And the third one, of course, is kind of that readiness in the moment that someone brings to that learning situation, right? If you've had um, a really difficult day, if you're processing trauma, if you're working through, any number of things that have you focused on something else, then you're going to be approaching that learning situation differently than others. So these are all examples of how we all might differ in our initial filter. It's partly an item that we've talked about before. Related to this, and I've got kind of the rose-colored glasses there, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is also sometimes referred to as kind of an illusion of competence. It's related to this idea, and I'll put in the missing citations here as we upload this for everybody. But it's related to this concept of illusory superiority, and that is that when people have built up a bit of skill in something, most people for most things, they tend to have an inflated sense of their competence with that. And it's partly why, for example, 80% of drivers and more than one survey um, identify themselves as above average. Where the Dunning-Kruger effect really comes in, though, is around novices. It's around people who are starting to learn information that they're not familiar with. As they start to make their way through it, there is this tendency to have a real inflated sense of how one is doing, or how close one is to be able to kind of demonstrate mastery of whatever that task is. An example is actually in this article. There was a nice little study on a series of a debate team tournament. And what they found is that the teams who were out in the first round, when they checked in with them to see how they thought they did, they had the largest discrepancy between how they actually did and how they thought they did. Not only did they think they were achieving at a much higher level and that they'd be going on to round two, most of them, but they didn't know enough to know what errors they had made or what missteps had kind of taken place. So this is really the Dunning-Kruger effect, or the illusions of competence, cognitive bias, just kind of at a glance, right? It's basically when a novice learner is engaging in kind of the learning journey, they are very likely to misjudge what they need to focus on, how much more they can learn, partly because they're feeling pretty confident about it. And we're going to talk about why they might be feeling confident in the next couple of slides. But what this ends up leading to is an incorrect or insufficient focus. Sorry, just give me 30 seconds here. Yeah. Okay, third challenge, of course, and this Neil partly just kind of alluded to and talked to there, is confusing comfort with efficacy, right? The consensus in the research is clear. Easier processing does not mean better processing. Oftentimes, what feels comfortable for learners as they're self-regulating their learning isn't actually pushing their learning as forward as they think. So a couple of illustrations. A number of, and kind of an amalgamation of a whole series of different experiments. This researcher, Cornell, found that 72% of college students reported massed practice as more effective than spaced practice. The experiments differed, but what they essentially did is they had students engaging in either spaced or massed practice, and then kind of checking in on how they felt about it afterwards. So most people definitely found that mass practice was more helpful for them. This was in juxtaposition or in opposition to what actually happened for these same students. So 90% of them did better when they engaged in mass practice, but only 28% of those same students actually recommended massed or spaced practice as an alternative to mass practice. So there's a real discrepancy here between what they actually accomplished and what they felt was more effective. The argument for that, I'm trying to remember if I've got it here. Here we go. The argument for this, or the explanation for this, is that massed practice or cramming gives this illusion of competence because it's easy to build up fluency when you have a lot of scaffolds, right? When someone is working through worked examples with you, when you are repeating the same type of task or the same type of problem over and over again, there's this sense that you've really kind of got it, but it doesn't mean that you do in quite the same way as spaced practice would show us. Just going to speed up here a little bit. The second example for confusing comfort with efficacy comes around a really common study strategy. Whenever students are surveyed, especially high school and up, rereading comes up as one of the most common strategies that folks will engage in. The challenge here is that it does feel good. It definitely feels like it ought to be working, but when we check, it doesn't work as well at all as retrieval practices. The underlying bias here is one around recognizing as opposed to knowing. So students will confuse the familiarity they get as they look at worked examples or they look at text with actually knowing it. Okay, sorry about that, Neil. I'll skip over to the next one here. Sorry, Neil, I'm past 10.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't I just skip this part and we'll move to you.
Okay. Sorry, we're not doing a good job of our time today because we messed up early at the beginning. But we'll pass over and I'll take it from here to the end. So what we want to do now just shift to a little bit about applying that to teachers. So Satnam's kind of given us 3 ways that it affects learners. What we want to do now is think about what that does similarly for on the teacher side. Graham Nuttall is an interesting New Zealand researcher, spent his life, he's passed away now, but he spent his life in classrooms, decades and decades in classrooms, transcribing classroom discourse between students, and wrote this fascinating book, The Hidden Lives of Learners. His point, or his quote, is that the central business of teaching is about creating changes in the minds of students and what they know, can do, how they think. The ability to create change means that in some way, teachers need to be constantly reading the minds of students. So if learning is a long-term change in memory, we can't see it. And so if we can't read the minds of students, the question is, what do you rely on to judge student learning? And we choose a whole bunch of things. And I put that Willingham memory in there because even from the teacher perspective, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the environment that we could choose as evidence of learning. So learning is difficult to see and judge, has 3 influences on teaching that we'll go through here: short-term performance, proxies of learning, and potentially overvaluing student self-reported confidence. The first one we've talked about quite a bit last week, but basically, if we overvalue what happens in the moment, what looks like evidence in one class period is something that may be still just in a student's working memory. And so if we do an experience once, or we have students try something once, and they have all the recency, they just did it, they practiced it, they've talked about it, and we judge that as learning, and we never come back to it, then that's problematic. And so what we're doing is we're equating the fact that a student can do something once with the fact that it's long-term learning. Now, doing it once in the moment is good. It means that, I remember Dylan Williams saying this, and it really kind of connected with me. It means that they're on the right trajectory, but it doesn't guarantee a change in long-term memory. If they can add those 2 fractions together that day, it doesn't mean they can add them tomorrow, but it's more likely that they will. So we have to do more thinking of the long term. The second one, and this is, again, kind of a really kind of struck me in a difficult way. I read a number of reports from Rob Coe from the UK, who's led a number of research organizations. And he has this list that he calls poor proxies for learning. And proxies are things that we replace. So if we can't see learning because it's invisible, these are things that we often replace for learning as evidence. And what he says from the research are not good proxies for learning. Now, they're good things, but they're not necessarily evidence of learning. For example, if students are busy, that doesn't guarantee learning. If they're completing things, even if they're doing the things we ask them to do, it doesn't mean that they're learning. It means that they're doing the things we want them to do. If the tasks are designed well, it could be building their learning, but we have to check that in a different way. Students might be engaged, interested, motivated. They may love the thing that they're doing. Doesn't mean they're guaranteed that they're picking up on the learning that you want. I think of an example. My own son was did a project recently in his school, not a Delta school, of course, where they spent a whole bunch of time building rockets, and he loved it. He loved building the rockets. I've asked him a few times about sort of what did he learn about rocket design or aerodynamics, and they didn't talk about any of that. And so he was engaged, he was interested, he was motivated, but he didn't come away with any deeper understanding of aerodynamics or flight. Now, of course, engagement is fine, is good. Like, we want kids to be doing exciting things, and that's okay. And there's totally a place for that. But we can't assume that because they're engaged, they're learning. That's the key. They might be getting attention from you. They might be getting feedback. They might be getting explanations. Your classroom might be ordered, calm, under control, or it might be busy, hands-on. All of these things. The classroom environment is not necessarily a clear evidence of learning. The curriculum may have been presented to students, may have been covered. And finally, some students may have provided some answers, even if they have not understood them, can't reproduce them independently, might have forgotten, or already know how to do this. So those are all, when I saw this list, I found it challenging. I thought these are things that we often hold up as, and they're good things. Please don't hear me saying that these are not good things. The challenge here is to not equate those with evidence of learning, right? If the way we've been defining it in this class, learning is a long-term change in what we're able to do. So we have to check it in a different way than what is on this list. Okay, and the third one, this guy here, Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize psychologist, wrote a very famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's one of the core founders, starting in the 50s, 60s, of the whole idea of cognitive biases and all the ways that human decision-making can be problematic. And he's got a quote that struck me. It is wise to take admissions of uncertainty seriously. However, declarations of confidence mainly tell you that an individual has constructed a coherent story, not necessarily that story is true. So the idea is a good story about learning isn't necessarily a true story about learning. Perhaps said another way from this book here, Responsive Teaching, knowing what students understand is more useful than knowing whether they are confident in it. Okay, so that could be potentially challenging. If learners are often ineffective judges of their own learning, how might that shape for us how we assess learning? Now, one really important thing I want to be clear about here, while what we're saying from cognitive science, it suggests that learners can often be poor judges of their learning. And as Satnam said with the Dunning-Kruger, particularly the more novice we are, the more possible it is that we misjudge. Although it suggests that they can be poor judges and that teachers should consider self-reports of learner confidence in combination with evidence for learning, or hold those carefully, we are not saying that we shouldn't value student voice or agency. Absolutely not. We should continue to seek out and learn from students' experiences in and out of school and provide meaningful opportunities to students to express themselves. So we're not saying student voice doesn't matter at all. What we're saying is reports of confidence need to be held carefully. So 3 things there. I'll just give you 30 seconds just to think about. Those are the 3 I've just gone over. Do any of those conflict with your current beliefs or practices, or challenge you, or get your back up in any way? And we'll give you a minute, because we've been talking a lot, just to kind of think about that. Any thoughts you want to throw in the chat? And then we will switch in the last few minutes just to go over some practical strategies to help. Okay, we'll keep going with 5 minutes left here and get some, that's all very challenging stuff. What are some classroom strategies? Yeah.
Neil, can I just interrupt you for a second? Sorry, it's Lorraine.
Yeah.
We just started, we've got 2 very different generations of teachers in this room, right? Me with 3 decades of teaching, and 2 people who are in their first decade of teaching. And one of the things that we're very aware of is how teacher education practices have changed. Because 30 years ago, when I was going through the teacher program, all of those other things that you just said, that were, you know, the 1, 2, and 3 in your previous slides, those were all the things that we were told was how to judge yourself as doing a good job.
Yep.
right? That if you've got a nice orderly classroom, blah, 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 that, you know, we never heard learning is messy. We never heard it's okay to walk away from curriculum. We never heard those things. Now, I think this generation of teachers has been given the freedom, but maybe so much so that the meat and potatoes of curriculum has disappeared,
Yeah, I
right?
would
Yeah.
say when engagement
Yeah.
is considered the
Yeah.
and not necessarily what does that engagement lead to.
Right. Did you hear that? Engagement.
No.
Say that again louder.
So back when I was getting mine in my, 5 years ago or whatever, more than that doesn't sound like, was the idea that engagement was key,
Yeah.
but not always fully assessed on what that engagement led to.
And I think the way Lorraine, I think the way you've pitched those two two extremes or two ends, I think what we're trying to do is find that middle ground, which is we want to be learning focused. We want to be looking, we want to enjoy the options or enjoy what the new curriculum offers in terms of a learning focus, an engagement focus, but also be aware of how we ground that in what we know about how learning happens and is best developed. And so if we strive only for activities or experiences purely for the engagement, it doesn't guarantee learning. It helps set the table, absolutely. But that's what I found so interesting about the cult of pedagogy quote is from a cognitive science perspective, going over information concepts multiple times is actually more important and more powerful than how we structure the engagement of the initial experience of it. And so we're trying to, what Sat and I are trying to do is try to nuance the middle ground here of how can we learn what seems to be working the most, or what are our best bets in terms of the ways we think about learning with students. But also, we're not advocating, this is not a swing back to 1950s, everybody in rows, worksheets and textbooks. We're going to get into the next few weeks more around how we consider higher order thinking and developing understanding and those types of parts of this. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yes, and so the next part of that for us then became a quick discussion about, what we still call the new curriculum, but the new curriculum now with all of this is kind of obsolete then, because if the goal with engaging learning into that place of long-term memory, if that's the goal, then we need to look hard and fast at how we are expected to deliver curriculum and how we are expected to assess for sure. But if we want cyclical learning, if we want to go deeper, then we need to look at, for example, grade 4, 5. How can I possibly get in the addition, division, multiplication, subtraction, financial literacy, geometry, and probability in 10 months if what I'm really needing to do is make sure that I'm cycling back all the time?
Yeah.
Right. So our whole curriculum basis has to be looked at.
Yeah. And part of it's not just, and that we would like to move ahead because I know people will be waiting. Part of that's also not just an individual approach, but how do you work together as a team in a school? If we're going to slow down and go over things multiple times, we do that with the belief that it helps students generate those skills better. And so coordinating that a little bit more at the school level maybe would help. So great questions, and we'll keep going because there are just some practical things I want to get to, and we're already at 4 o'clock. So these are some strategies. These are all like big topics, each one of these, but just some quick thoughts on how we, what to do in response. Number one is we've already gone over it. If we want to get past short-term, being sort of seduced by the short-term performance, we want to be looking at ways to return to learning over time. And that was everything we talked about last week. We talked about retrieval space, interleave. So even just building that into our classrooms, and even thinking about asking questions about what we did yesterday, what we did last week, what we did last month, what we did 6 months ago. Like building that in regularly is going to build the learning, and it's also going to help us judge and assess the long-term learning in a different way. Asking more learning questions is another one. And this is a huge topic of how to ask good questions in the classroom. But from this book here, and this book's gone out to a bunch of schools that have signed up, research confirms that effective teachers ask more questions, involve more students, probe more in depth, take more time to explain. And so a lot of this comes from Dylan Williams' work, reducing the typical questioning in classroom that's called the IRE, the initiation response evaluation, which is teacher asks a question, one kid answers it, the teacher evaluates the response. What we want to do is, have classrooms that are more like passing an idea around, everyone participating rather than just table tennis. Student to teacher, student to teacher, student to teacher. No hands up is a huge part of this. Having a classroom culture where we can draw on students at different times, and something else called no opt-out. If a student can't answer something or is unsure, then we want to try to go to someone else, get some information, then come back and see if that student has it. All of those are not easy. I recognize that. All of those are sort of part of a classroom culture we have to build up over time. Having all students' response systems as a part of this as well can be really simple with just cards or show me boards, whiteboards. I know lots of classes use those. Finger voting, and we're going to look at a couple quick examples of that. And there's something called the hypercorrection event, which is we actually learn more from making mistakes and getting corrected right away than we do from getting the right answer. And so somehow asking questions, having every student respond, and then giving the right answer as soon as possible, if there is one, helps correct more quickly. There's asking explanatory questions. Tom Sherrington and others really talk about this idea of using say it again better. So if a student responds to a question, really try, and it could be improved, building a culture where you help students improve their questions. Try it again. Use some of the vocabulary that we just talked about to make it more precise. Using probing questions. I'll go through this quick because we're past 4. But there's some list of some sample probing questions. Again, if you have the Rosenshine book at your school, there's lots more probing questions in there. Something else is called diagnostic questions, which are really target questions that we can ask in a classroom that are very specific around trying to diagnose where students are at on a topic or skill. We want to avoid open-ended ones and have more sort of specific and often sort of multiple choice. So you may use something like this. You could use, if you're teaching adverbs, you could use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers to sort of represent set answers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the question is, which word is an adverb, right? Another one you could do here, this is a math one. Sometimes we get a lot from just a few questions, and these fraction questions are asked in a very specific way. Anybody have a sense of what they notice about the progression of those questions? And you can drop it in the chat if you think you know, or you have an idea, or you can grab the mic. Anybody notices? They're harder. Yeah, they're harder in a specific way. Yeah, thanks, Michaela. So they start with common denominator, the first 2. And there's something different about the first two, even with the common denominator. What does the second one do that the first one doesn't? Yes, so the second one goes over 1, exactly. So the first one is, can a student add 2 fractions, common denominator below 1? The second one is over 1. The next 3 are all mixed denominators. And they go from an easy kind of mixed denominator to a harder one that goes over 1. And so by asking 5 questions to students, you could get a sense of 5 different levels of student understanding of fractions, right? Which is very different than saying, how do you feel, how confident are you in your fractions, right? So 5 questions could be used really quickly. Hinge questions, and Dylan William talks about this quite a bit. Hinge questions are a type of diagnostic question that are kind of foundational to a concept. And in his writings, what we do is we use them at a hinge point in the lesson. So we use them to decide, can we go on? Do my students understand this or not? So for example, this could be one, but we could have used a few weeks ago. Students are most likely to encode new information to long-term memory if they are A, B, or C. Let's see what people think about this. Use A for 1, use your fingers. 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C. What would you answer? Lots of people have their mics off. So for those who are answering, lots of 3s. And a few other answers. From a cognitive science perspective, it would be 3. It would be that they are more likely to encode it if there are things that are similar and that they can connect to, right? We tend to believe, we tend to want the emotion and the motivation, and it's not that those don't matter. Those help, absolutely. But in terms of what's actually going to help it get into long-term memory, it's more likely that the previous learning that they have will help with that. Last thing I'll quickly, I think it's our last slide, or one of them. This is a collection of diagnostic hinge questions around science, which came across years ago, which I think is quite interesting. It's an American thing, so it's not perfect for us. But what it does is you go into, if you're teaching science, you can go here into the assessments. And there's a whole bunch of science topics. So for example, weathering, erosion. And then it has a bunch of knowledge, conceptual knowledge. So let's say, for example, this first one, the surface of the earth is changed as rock is broken, carried, dropped. And what they've got is a bunch of discrete bits of knowledge. For example, that water breaks rocks, carries them, and deposits them in new. And what it actually tells you here, and again, this is US, but it says in grades 6 to 8, this is the amount of misconceptions. So they've used these questions on thousands of students. 60% often get these wrong. It's a misconception, and in grades. Oh, sorry, I got it backwards. This is the amount of students that answer it correctly. But if you go down to the very bottom here, only 24% and 26% of students typically get these right. And if you click on here, you actually see the question. It gives you a multiple choice question. Can wind ever be strong enough to break and move the size of a rock, the size of a boulder? And A, B, C, D. The answer over here is C. What's interesting is it tells you misconceptions A and D, and it'll actually, there's links to the misconceptions and why they are misconceptions. And it'll tell you the performance on different grades and genders and things. So just thought it was an interesting resource on hundreds and hundreds of pre-made hinge questions. What do we do with this information all when we collect it? I love this quote from Gillian William at the bottom. Formative assessment is so different from summative. I wish I'd called it responsive teaching. So we collect this information so that we respond to it instructionally. So that it helps us as teachers know, do we need to review, explain something different, or can we move on, knowing that students are demonstrating the understanding that we want. So that's it for this session. Sorry we went a little long. The front was a bit of a dog's breakfast. Tried something and it didn't go as well as we wanted, but here's the exit slip I want you to try. A bunch of schools have been using the Writing Revolution, which has a whole bunch of great, really practical writing strategies. And one of them is called Because But So. What you do is you give students a sentence starter and ask them to complete that sentence. So what I want you to please do on your way out is answer these 3 questions, and you can share them in the chat if you like. Performance does not guarantee learning because, performance does not guarantee learning but, and performance does not guarantee learning so. As you're doing that, I'll just share again, we have a bunch of other videos and things you might want to read to go further with this. We'll share them they're on the website. We share these slides, we share all the notes and everything. They usually go up the same day, although Satnam and I may burn the video from this one, so we may have to re-record this one. But that's it for today. We'll stop there. If you want to fill out that exit slip for yourself, or you want to share it with in the chat, that would be great. If you have any questions, or we'll gladly stick around and chat with anyone. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.